discussion is on kind of a provocation that one of our colleagues, Sahil, kind of threw at us, which was around trying to find what are the parallels between a certain discourse in human development and anthropology that has emerged over the years, which is around intersectional thinking and or intersectionality. And in the design practice, some sort of parallels, which I'm not quite sure if they address the issue in the same way, but when we think of interconnected systems and how there are dependencies, some obvious, some actually quite some that are in the blind spot of designers. I think there was an interesting point there of just trying to interrogate this and see if there are commonalities, if there are things that we can borrow. And so this is not really our classic panel discussion where any of us are coming at it from a highly sort of refined point of view. I think most of us, as you can see, with laptops and our phones and our diaries out, have been struggling with trying to figure out what is the commonality. So we want to set this up as really a discussion between ourselves and between all of you there, because I'm sure you're also in this room because the topic intrigued and perhaps you have questions to ask. So the way we'll do this is we'll have quick comments from all the panelists on what their interpretation of the topic is. And I'll let the panelists describe and kind of introduce themselves. So just quick comments on that, and then we'll open it to questions between ourselves and also with the audience. Right? So we really treat this entire 50 minutes that we have as a large discussion between all of us.
Come here as a researcher who I identify myself as a feminist researcher working in the space of gender, reproductive health and rights issues for the last 20 years.
My name is Bas Rijmakers. I'm from Standby, which is a design research agency in Amsterdam and London.
Thank you. Good morning. So I'm going to address this from 2 points of view, wearing kind of two hats. I teach, I'm visiting faculty at the Shrishti Institute for Art, Design and Technology, but I've also just started my own not-for-profit called Design Beku. And Design Beku is basically an opportunity to help NGOs, charities, organizations that can't really afford good design collateral provided by designers on a voluntary and pro bono basis.
Good morning. I'm Heather Vahdat from the Male Contraceptive Initiative. And what I find really interesting about this discussion is contraception has been a one-sided field for almost the entire existence. And there's a lot of good reasons for that. I mean, obviously women bear the brunt of a pregnancy much more strongly than men. So in the past few years, I've been working in contraception in general for 12 years now, mostly in female contraception, and I've moved to male contraception about 6 months ago. But I really find it interesting that for so many years, contraception has always been more of a prescriptive field. It was very medicalized, very politic, and unnecessarily so. So people started to kind of back up a little bit and talk across practices and realize the impact that conversations around contraception can have on poverty, on environment, on menstrual hygiene, all sorts of different areas. And so we kind of run this joke that if you give me 5 minutes, I promise I can make a path from contraception to your area of practice. And seriously, I've done it for road safety, so if you but I think what's really interesting in what we're doing now at MCI is really finding ourselves in the middle of this discussion between gender in particular. And, women and men and trust issues and relationships, I mean, you name it, it's all there. And, women saying, I don't know if I do want my partner to use contraception, and men saying, well, I don't know if I want to use contraception. But what we're finding is that most people in the middle are saying, I'm at least intrigued, I want the options. That's sort of the summation that we get, is everybody wants the option to control their own sexual and reproductive health. And that's what we're really here to do. And it's just building the case for that. And it's such a unique concept that even getting people to think about it for themselves is really interesting. So sort of there's this individual intersectional conversation that has to happen as well. It's like, how does this play into my life personally? And, we're writing it as we go too, because some of the conversations when you're talking about trust, it's like, well, that's fine. If you don't trust your partner, then you both can contracept, all the better. Or, you know, different stages of your life journey. You know, when you're younger, you're going to have different desires for your reproductive health, and when you're in your mid-stage, when you're having children, let's say you're spacing, or maybe you're young and you don't want to have children. And so the conversations are just really engaging and interesting, and I feel like we're kind of in a fortunate maybe position that the intersectionality just happens organically. And so I feel like why we're here at UnBox is to learn how to manage that better and to have conversations with people from very different backgrounds to learn from them.
So I want to pick on two things. One is, as you know, a design practice that is in the field of human-centered design or user-centered design, I think one of our biggest struggles in any project is trying to define who the user is, right? And that boundary, you know, when you throw yourselves in a context, and we just recently come out of a project we were doing with the government of Rajasthan on adolescent sexual and reproductive health. Suddenly, you know, the boundaries that you have to embrace in order to be able to intervene, they just keep expanding. And so one is, you know, it's not just the user, it's the household, it's the society, and everything that intersects. But sometimes you also have to turn the table and say, is it really important to put the user at the center, right? Could it be nature-centered design, and user just at the periphery? And I think we were talking about that in the just a few minutes before that. For me, all of these issues are a kind of speaking to the idea of intersectionality, right? What I found really interesting is also just speaking to the power and privilege that design carries. I think raising the consciousness of designers to be aware of the exclusions that are not always in the frame that you take into the field, I think is really important. And that's what this discourse, I think, offers as a promise, right? It's just raising the consciousness of the design practitioner around the things that don't fall in the frame that you capture. So that's something that was just coming to me and thought I'd share with you. Anyone else who'd like to pick up a point or any kind of continuing thoughts from what we've spoken?
I don't think we are actually doing enough justice to women's experiences within that context of sexual oppression. And I always wonder, like, we kind of box these things as to this is the intervention. But the intervention is really not expansive. We're not dealing with the politics of oppression. We're not taking on institutional oppression. So that's one thing that I constantly worry about, you know, these kind of very Western homogenous models that we are incorporating, and we are not actually interrogating what we bring in as a practice. The other thing I wanted to also add is this whole idea about social categorization. Like, as researchers, what do? We say, okay, we're going to quantitatively analyze the experience of race or caste or education, and it's fairly additive social categorizations, and we say, yeah, women who are lower caste, less educated, from lower socioeconomic, are less likely to use contraception, are less likely to be able to negotiate contraceptive use. But the fact is, there's much more to what happens in the private intimacy of sexual negotiation between a woman and a man. And especially, we don't understand those particular experiences. It isn't just belonging to a category. It's much more around, if a woman has always been oppressed, if she's always felt victimized and vulnerable, how does she even begin to have power or agency within a very, very intimate space such as this? So in order to empower or give agency, you have to work on many other experiences that are shaping her vulnerability. And it isn't just about, okay, does she have decision or communication within a very, very intimate space. So again, these are all complications. I don't think we've done enough justice to this. There's a lot of research available, but when we try and package this back into interventions, we're fairly reductionist. And I think that is part of the problem. Which I think this conversation, we should kind of start challenging our own notions and understanding of intersectionality as much as we embrace it.
Thanks. So I think one thing that we've been seeing And there's a project that we've been working on about women who are either pregnant or just who have just had children, and the kind of information they get around pregnancy online. So what kind of things are they looking for, etc. And so one of the sites we've been working in is Channapatna, which is a village nearby. Our research assistant Zainab is here. And something that we found really interesting, which I think kind of goes against the grain of traditional design research, is that when we talk about personas, when we talk about user personas, we are assuming a mental model of that they possess, which is very universalized. And I'll tell you kind of why I feel that this kind of broke down in this particular project. So as you were saying, most women who have been oppressed in some way or the other have a very fragmented or possibly absent sense of self, right? You know, because their self is defined completely by everything else that is around them. So their families, their husbands, etc., etc. And one of the things that one of the doctors we've been working with told us, which was really quite eye-opening for us, was that she said that so we were talking about the possibilities of postnatal depression and, you know, how would we track postnatal depression for these women. And she said, you know, for them, even identifying PND is difficult because they don't see themselves in a kind of unified way that somebody who is less oppressed does. So if we were to even introduce that into the conversation, that might actually completely disrupt their sense of who they think they are and almost kind of, you know, cause something quite destabilizing, right? And this for us was quite a revelation, because when you work with personas, you are assuming that at least, you know, everybody has a sense of who they are, which is what we are then interpreting, you know, when we're looking at users. And that kind of model completely breaks down when we look at this. So as you were saying, you know, in that context, it's much more useful to work with stories and narratives and then, you know, kind of take it from there rather than, you know, assuming personas. And I think something, you know, that we need to also kind of accept is that this idea of the user is very much kind of, you know, the kind of opposite of user is client, right? Like, so it's a kind of, you know, it's very much a artifact of design as, you know, as commercial or corporate practice. And, you know, now I think there's a move towards design activism, which obviously kind of demands maybe different perspectives. So
at this point,
you know, when you were talking, this made me think also, one of the things that I wanted to raise is, just our assumptions, like when we're doing research. I mean, I typically have been in a space where I'm asking questions and I'm looking at survey questions and categories that we have to understand, for example, sexual behavior. And especially around contraception, we kind of assume that there is a unitary model. There is a man and a woman, and they have sex, and they have sex that is for reproduction, not just for pleasure. And in any case, and that there is some frequency of sex that therefore needs protection. But actually, so all our questions are designed around this assumption of a male-female model or a heterosexual relationship. But when you actually go to the ground and you start interrogating, you realize, and it's through qualitative research, there are many configurations of sexual relationships, behaviors. It isn't only a male-female model. We found in a recent research that I was doing a couple of years back in UP that I was surprised. It was on gender-based violence, but I was surprised how many women had never had sex with their husbands and how many women were actually single or abandoned because but when we talk to them, we assume they are in need of contraception. So our point of entry is, okay, when did you last have sex? Are you using a protection? Why haven't you used a method of protection? Do you know you can use an IUD or you can do this? But this is a woman who hasn't ever had sex or has extremely infrequent sex. And we don't really understand that there are all kinds of relationships that happen within a household, and the husband may actually be having sex with his sister-in-law and not with the woman he's married to, or with the man. And so again, I think from a design perspective, I think we have to also be open and empathize that there aren't homogeneous experiences, and we have to really go with that understanding.
Well, the only thing, listening to you guys talk, it's interesting. So not being a design person myself, but definitely a fan of design, and having seen through my work with Quicksand just what it can accomplish, I find that where we are right now, is specifically talking about MCI. I mean, all of your points are right on, and but we're coming into this, or at least I hope we are, with a fresh page, and so we kind of have an opportunity, an obligation even, to try and do this the right way, and to really learn from our peers and our colleagues, and that's another reason why we're here, because we're already feeling, I mean, the reason that one of the main reasons there hasn't been a male method of contraception is because of this top-down dismissive kind of sentiment that people don't want it. And so what I've loved about being here is this theme of storytelling, and I realize that's I didn't have the right nomenclature for it, but that's really what we're trying to do, is literally walking up to people on the street and saying, you know, what do you think about this? And taking those stories back. And for us, and if you don't see MCI in 2 years, it's my fault for this, but it's not about trying to get millions of users. It's about trying to demonstrate that there's a spectrum of users. So it's just as important to me to have someone walk into that booth upstairs and say, I don't want it, and walk out, as it is for someone to come in and spend 90 seconds talking about the complexities of relationships and all of those things. So I think that I feel a little selfish in this panel in that I only can learn from you all. And so I think that those opportunities as they present are great for you guys to make an intersectional connection as well. And I know that we're very open to that.
I would like to open this now to everybody else in the room. So please go ahead. You had a question.
I wanted to pick up this idea of power. It's the thing that interests me about this discussion the most, and the paradox of where that lies. And then within that, this idea of, say, a responsibility to act and someone's right to be represented, or have more clear and accurate stories told about them. But ultimately, at the heart of that, there's this tricky paradox in which pretty much everyone in this room, I would guess, sits somewhere closer to some node of power. And we begin to feel a sense of responsibility that we ought to better represent this additional separate world that's out there, separate from our world, really. And I find that dichotomy a little bit of a paradox, and it's a difficult thing to resolve. So maybe we could open up some thoughts about this tricky paradox of rights versus responsibilities, and where power really lies. And I guess finally, just one last thing to throw in there as a stimulus would be, does decentralization play some role in this in the future? There's a lot of discussion now about a decentralized economy, and we're starting to have these discussions about decentralized money. But could design thinking, I'm not a designer, so I really have no idea. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about it. What would that look like, where perhaps rights and responsibilities to act in a certain way are dissolved, but the process itself is decentralized in some way? So I'd be interested to hear anybody's thoughts about that.
Can I just very quick response to that? One is, absolutely, when you're talking about decentralized system, I think that is a very good example of infrastructural change that kind of makes a lot of the structural problems not go away, but kind of addresses those, right? The other thing about representation, I think, which is super important, is that myself, with as a Savarna woman, which is kind of a dominant caste woman, in case that needs defining, is that I don't feel that it is my right, or actually even responsibility, to represent. It is to amplify and to give space and to look at myself, or colleagues in the feminist movement, for example, and think about what we are doing that is reinforcing those structural problems and address those. So I feel like there's only so much time, right? So where our energies should be or could be usefully employed, I think, is in that space. It's kind of saying how are we complicit with these systems? So how do we kind of address that? Because I don't feel like, I don't think it's right that we should be thinking about representation at all. And I think the other, and this is obviously a much long-term change, is that we don't have people from non-dominant caste communities in design, in tech, like not enough, right? That's what we need to be facilitating, is that, allowing kind of, education to kind of spread to people so that they feel like they could have a career in technology, or that they could have a career, and then only does representation become possible in a true sense, I think.
No, I'm going to somewhat, I totally understand your question, and this is like constantly our own struggles as we've been working in the development space. I'm not poor, I'm not socially vulnerable compared to many other women, but I still work on these issues with extreme passion. So I'm going to somewhat challenge this and only say that, we've taken this on as something, as a society, that we want a better and just society. We want a more inclusive and just society. What is my role as somebody with power and privilege to create that? So I'm going to take the onus in a very different way. Rather than say, I have power and privilege, can I really represent the vulnerabilities of those who don't? Instead, I would counter that and say, I have power and privilege and therefore more responsibility to really counter and challenge than somebody who currently doesn't. And so I understand where you're coming from, but I also feel like that just places much more responsibility on us, and I'm not going to constantly be in an existential debate around this. I don't want to do that, because that's very defeating towards a larger purpose.
This is really, really interesting, just sort of as we're moving through this conversation again, thinking, I feel like you guys are all in these sectors that have so much heart, and then I talk about like just R&D and the thunk on the stage here, but it is really interesting when you talk about infrastructure. So again, this is something, because I really feel like we're sort of starting anew, we are trying to push those boundaries as well. And I've never really thought of it as a power dynamic before, but it is the opportunity dynamic. And really what we're trying to fight is this mind mentality of intellectual property in this, at least this small context, and just saying, like, reminding people of their environment and the realities of it. That, look, you work in contraceptive research and development. You've been chasing literally one molecule for decades because you can't get enough money to get it, to preclinical trials. So kind of bringing that reality into play and saying, what can we do differently? And that's what I've learned from the design side of things, is bringing people together and saying, look, you're going to have to give up a little bit of that mind mentality, and we need to start thinking about ours, because there's a lot of really odd complexities in the contraceptive space that I don't think people probably think about much, which is it's a fairly abandoned product space. So there is not a lot of big pharma dealing with contraception. So it's languished for many, many reasons, and I'm happy to talk on forever with that, with anybody who wants to talk after the fact, to get into that a bit more. But what it brings us back to is this idea that we can actually operate as a movement. I have a little bit of maybe an overly idealistic view of this, but in a product development sector, we can actually take this sphere, kind of go under the radar of the traditional infrastructural boundaries of being in a big pharmaceutical industry, or these big organizations that drive that. And you'll still have your challenges with regulatory and things like that, but again, approach that with dialogue and not necessarily unilateral authority. And actually it works. FDA, WHO, PQ, these people listen, and it's just people don't engage them. So that's really what we want to see, and really hopefully have an infrastructure where at least this one facet of product is able to kind of go out on its own and create its own new environment and new sort of infrastructure and approach to things.
My name is Akshay. I used to work at Quicksand, and I think where I struggle with this is just as designers, we're often playing the role of consultant, and that often means that there's this sort of hot potato with whatever you design. So I'm done with it. Here's back to the organization or to a bunch of grassroots organizations who have to go out there and implement something. So while you might be trying to design for intersectionality and you might have that sensitivity, I think what tends to happen when designers don't cross over and support implementation, I think the experience has been that anything that you design for becomes quite superficial. And so I think just sort of maybe amplifying what Padmini was saying, 2 points really resonate. One is don't design for users and personas, but for people, actual people. And I think the second bit being that the role of the designer, not as the one designing the intervention, but perhaps the scaffolding for the actual, in quotes, beneficiaries to be doing the solutioning for themselves. I don't think I started out with a question, maybe it's just a comment to amplify some experiences in the past couple of years of trying to do this work.
Yeah, just very quickly, absolutely. I mean, it seems very weird for me to agree when you're quoting me, but yes. But what I was going to say is that, but designing for sustainability, right? Like, because as you very rightly say, you go to a site and then obviously that's the way it works. And so kind of how do we build in sustainability and kind of hand over the hot potato, kind of warm state to the people who you're working with, so that they can then productively and generatively work with what you've done, right? And I think building in that is actually something that we need to be better at. So, yeah.
I mean, I think that, I don't know, I'm just wondering about design for intersectionality and what that means. I'm sorry, maybe this is a question for another panel. But I think to me, intersectionality is a heuristic. It's something that designers should have. Like it's a methodology, it's an approach, it's a state of questioning and interrogation. It's a social experiment. You're designing to change whatever, inclusive cities, whatever we might call it. But you're trying to change society. You're trying to change, dismantle power, I think, if you're really working in that space. So it's a constant state of interrogation. It isn't a discrete product or intervention, although that's, as a consultant, that's what you may be delivering. But as a methodologist or somebody with an approach towards design, you might be delivering something, but you're delivering something which will constantly raise the bar on further interrogation. So that's the way I would look at it, that it's an incomplete project. You're constantly going to... Sorry. Oh, no, that's okay. Yeah.
I do think this is really interesting because as, again, an observer of designers more than anything, I feel like designers are, for at least my practice area, the conduits of intersectionality. So you bring just from your daily work those experiences. And sometimes, I think with any work, and I would assume it's the same as design, sometimes you're going to hand a hot potato and it's just going to thud on the table again. But so you can only control the receptiveness of your clients so far. But it goes so far beyond that, because there was a woman that came and spoke to us at FHI where I used to work, and she said she's never seen someone, no matter what their field of practice, who was not changed by participation in a design activity. And I think that's absolutely true. And so I think you need to make sure and acknowledge those small changes too, because we all know that the small changes are just as important. And when I'm looking around the room and I see I hired someone who came from a design studio. I have a colleague out there who's now an independent consultant working in contraception who had not really, these folks had not had a lot of exposure to that. And, maybe it's just my pleasure that they're drinking the Kool-Aid, but I just think that the power is really there. And that's, to end on a positive note, I guess, maybe, is that's what is so great about design, is that it is the facilitator.
It's great to sort of have champions on the outside, because I still operate from a point of cynicism about design, because I feel like that consciousness is not there, and which is why, this was a great kind of topic to pick up. I just want to close, at least on my end, with sort of how I think, to your point about reductionism, and that's not just design, it's the practice of innovation, of social entrepreneurship, of everything, where there is an urgency to reduce it down to what you would put out. I think as a practice, it's really important to sustain an expansionist view of things even while you reduce. And if you can maintain that, right, then you're also, you're culturing at least some humility to know that what you put out is going to fail on certain counts and it will be challenged, right? So I think just sustaining that expansionist view at all times, even though your practice in your profession might require you to reduce it to what has to be designed, I think is really important as the culture that we need to try and bring into design studios.
Can I maybe add one kind of thing to what you put out?
A remark on my end.
So I think this is really about kind of the role that we have and can take also as a designer. Yes, we produce things, but I find it always very useful as well to look at what do we connect. Because we do make all kind of connections that otherwise would not exist. And in that sense, I recently came across this notion of the boundary spanner and the designer as a boundary spanner. We kind of spend time in quite different worlds in our work, and I think it's a really important role to take on, to be that boundary spanner and feel quite stretched, actually, at times, because the worlds can be very far apart. But the things we put out could really help people perhaps cross that bridge and kind of come into these other worlds, and that's really important, I think, as an achievement of our work, as impact of our work.
Great. So I'm going to use my prerogative now to call this panel to a close. But thank you once again. And thank you, everybody, for jumping in with great questions.